Are there any statements? The member for Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of Australia, wherever they may be, but in particular I acknowledge the special status of the Yorta Yorta, Bangarang and other Indigenous peoples in my electorate of Murray. Today I am recognising the anniversary of the National Declaration of Sorry Day on 13th February 2008. This followed on the motion of regret passed on the 26th of August 1999, moved by John Howard when he was Prime Minister, with words fashioned in consultation with Indigenous leaders of the day. The problem continues to be that few Australians are closely familiar with the facts of the contact history of our country, where we did have frontier wars as different Aboriginal nations fought to keep their land and defend their people, where we did have native police led by white officers with secret verbal instructions to track and disperse the natives, a euphemism for shooting to kill. We did have slavery, which we called the indenturing system, where Indigenous children were forced into labour without pay, some from the age of 6, with masters who could and did summon the police to track them down, punish them and return them to work when they escaped. We did have miscegenation policies, a euphemism for breed them white, when it was noticed that Aborigines of mixed descent were outnumbering so-called full-bloods in many places, and when the economy was desperately short of manual labourers. These colonial and post-Federation policies are described in detail and documented in a series of royal commissions and parliamentary inquiries in the House of Commons, in the UK, in every Australian colonial parliament, and then in the States and Commonwealth after 1901. Sworn evidence on page after page gives a window onto the attitudes and policies which we find unthinkable today, but which led to the need for the nation to say collectively sorry on the 13th of February 2008. I think it is timely to remind us, to be reminded of how far we have come as a nation in adjusting our attitudes and responses to the Indigenous peoples of Australia, the original owners. Today, Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders are acknowledged with protocols and with respect, where once they were mostly or only objects of sympathy or disgust or were racially vilified. In 1977, my documentary History of Official Government Policy and Race Relations was published after years of research, and I still reach to these documentary extracts to remind myself often that the miracle is that Aboriginal people survived with their oldest living culture intact or evolved in many parts of modern Australia, that some of their languages survive, but most importantly, their identity as Aboriginal peoples has never been stronger since the usurpation of their countries, which began in earnest in 1788. I want to read from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Papers, Volume 2, Part 2, 1929, when the Chief Protector, Mr Bleakley, reported on the conditions of the Aborigines and half-castes of Central Australia and North Australia. He reported under the heading Quadroons and Octoroons, after going through various other headings describing full-bloods and half-castes and so on. And I quote, "As already indicated, the crossbreed with a preponderance of white blood should be considered separately. Their blood entitles them to be given a chance to take their place in the white community and on as favourable a footing as possible. That this may be successfully accomplished, the children should be removed from Aboriginal associations at the earliest possible age and given all the advantages in education and vocational training possible to white state children to minimise as far as possible the handicap of their colour and friendless circumstances." He goes on, "To avoid the dangers of the blood call, employment should be found where they will not come into contact with Aborigines or Aboriginal half-castes. In spite of such precautions, however, a few will doubtlessly drift back, and it may be found advisable to allow, even encourage, the marriage of such difficult cases with crossbreeds of darker strain." He continues, "While official supervision and control is essential in their own interests, any appearance of branding with the Aboriginal stamp should be avoided so as not to hamper unduly their upward progress. For instance, a rigid application of the regulation rates of wages for Aboriginals would be manifestly unfair, as, with equal opportunities for learning, many should prove as useful as the average European servant." End of quote. This advice and Bleakley's recommendation were already in play in some parts of Australia at that time. We're talking about the 1920s. And following this very significant report to the government, they were taken up more seriously. And the children were removed from their parents, often forcibly, of course, and often, in particular, after a great deal of hunting and tracking by police to find those children. They were placed in missions and training institutions. These children are often referred to today as the stolen generations. But did the government of the day, whether state or Commonwealth, or the nascent territory government, did they in fact honour the misguided but philanthropic intentions of Chief Protector Bleakley and his like-minded officials and members of Parliament? Did he or did they in fact protect and educate these taken away children? Sadly, the children removed to be educated and raised as white were too often neglected and abused. In the House of Representatives Commonwealth parliamentary debates of 1939 to 1940, on the 7th of December, my predecessor, the member for Murray, Sir John McEwen, complained about the condition of the Alice Springs shelter for half-castes. You've already heard it referred to. He said, I quote, "There I saw a state of affairs which honourable members will find it difficult to believe. 120 half-caste children and 13 or 14 adult full-blooded and half-caste women. The parents of some of the young half-caste children living in that most deplorable old building, which when it rained heavily took in water as if there was no roof at all. The dormitories were a disgrace. The building was roofed with corrugated iron and had a concrete floor, so that it must have been too hot in summer and almost unbearably cold in winter. I know many stud stock breeders who would not dream of crowding their stock in the way these half-caste children were huddled in that institution at Alice Springs. Today I see that there is not one penny of the estimates to correct the deplorable state of affairs that exists at Alice Springs. It is a shameful thing to allow it to continue." End of quote. Sir John went on to describe the so-called half-caste compound at Darwin as equally shocking and disturbing and without any relief in sight. So again I repeat, it is right that we remind Australian citizens of this Parliament's sorry motion moved in Parliament 4 years ago. We need to also remind ourselves of its forerunner in the Howard government in 1999 and the Reconciliation Council, which worked for a number of years, and I was proudly a government representative on that council, trying to put together a statement which in some way managed to mean for all Australians a serious and real statement of reconciliation. We need to continue, however, to translate a sense of sorrow and regret into real actions and new commitments for all Australians. I'm very pleased to be the Deputy Chair of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander Affairs. We've just completed a study of adolescent youths in custody, and we are now considering how to retain and restore Indigenous languages at the same time that all Indigenous children become fluent in English so they can fully participate in the broader Australian society. This is important work, and I'm constantly struck by the goodwill and well-meaning of those working in the fields of linguistics, education and policy making who step forward to give evidence to our inquiry. They are Aboriginal people, they are non-Aboriginal people from every background and from every part of Australia. We have come a very long way from our often brutal colonial views and actions. We are a great nation with a great future for all Australians, and our spirit of reconciliation is a lesson to be learned by many other countries struggling to reach the point we are now at in our nation. But we must never forget the past as we build a better future. We must never forget that all things are possible when different parts of the country forget that we are in fact all humans with equal opportunities and with an equal sense of humanity.